Hello, welcome to 30 Minutes. I'm Rick Anthony. For most of his career, Peter Key has been chronicling the events and the people who make up the business community in the Philadelphia area. As a writer-journalist for the Philadelphia Business Journal for 15 years until just last year, Peter's byline has been synonymous with breakthrough technology, new ventures, what's been exciting in the business community in the Philadelphia region. Today, Peter spends most of his time telling his fabled father story, Ted Key, a renowned, I don't know how best to describe your dad, I'll get to you in just a moment, except that he was best known for his most popular creation, Hazel, the iconic cartoon that many of you, I'm sure, grew up with, may still see in some publications because it's still syndicated around the country. Following Hazel was Peabody and Sherman, the stars of a new animated movie that is just being released and is getting rave reviews around the country. As a matter of fact, it's on the marquee just across from the studio here in Wayne. Peter, welcome to 30 Minutes.
Thank you. Nice
Glad
to be
have
here.
you with us. I knew you, of course, as the writer-journalist of the Philadelphia Business Journal.
Yes.
I had no idea. I guess I did know at one point that you were the son of a prominent personage. On the other hand, I didn't know much about it until quite recently. I didn't know that your father, for 57 years, lived right up on Valley Forge Mountain, and that you apparently grew up in Valley Forge Mountain.
I didn't grow up in Valley Forge Mountain. Actually, he lived in Valley Forge.
Oh.
And the house is in Tredyffrin Township. We always referred to it as Valley Forge, and its mailing address was Wayne. So it was in Chester County, but had a post office address in Delaware County. So the house was in an identity crisis.
I think it, sounds better, Valley Forge Mountain. I always like that. I only know one person who lives in Valley Forge Mountain, Tony Aquilante, and his children, 16 of them. That's why they own the top of the mountain. Did your father, particularly in his, he died in 2008, did he prefer anonymity? Was he kind of a retiring, self-assuming person?
No.
No?
He was not. He was not. First of all, he was kind of anonymous by nature because of the fact that while his creations were known, his face was not. It's not like he was a movie star. I mean, when Hazel was at its most popular, people knew who he was. When I was growing up, for example, all my schoolmates knew who he was.
Yes.
And I remember one time he was out mowing the lawn and people stopped. People who were driving by stopped to see if he would do anything funny. But, you know, he wasn't well known in terms of being recognizable. But he, you know, he wanted his creations to be well known. He was very proud of his creations. And so he wasn't, he didn't really seek out anonymity either. I mean, he liked the idea that he was a well-known creator for much of the middle of the 20th century.
Like so many prominent artists, really good artists, his work has transcended time and has transcended generations. I think it's still attracting fans, young people, as well as older folks like me who remember it from my childhood. Did your father know, do you think, that his work would live on and would continue to attract fans? And did he care?
Oh, yeah, he cared. I mean, I think he hoped that it would.
Yeah.
You never know whether it will or not.
Yes.
You know, you want, as an artist, pretty much everything you do to be timeless, I would think. And, you know, a lot of his stuff was. I mean, some of it wasn't because the cartoons that he drew were of an era. He was a magazine cartoonist from about 1935 when he moved to New York, really up through the 70s. By that time, Hazel was in newspapers. And if you go back and look at those cartoons, many of them are funny, but some of them are so much of the time that they're more used to historians than they are people wanting to get a laugh. But some of his characters really withstood the test of time, and I think I think Peabody and Sherman did, and he had a major role in creating them.
We'll get to that in a minute because they evolved over time, right? Those
Very
creations.
briefly.
Yeah.
I mean, they became Peabody and Sherman from his original idea for them in probably around a year or less. But they've been Peabody and Sherman since.
What was the inspiration for Hazel? Where did that come from?
He had a dream, and it was in 1943, and he'd been a successful cartoonist by then for 8 years, and he'd done writing for radio in New York. He had a play published on the, well, performed, I guess, on the radio in 1939 called The Clinic that was named one of the best broadcasts of the year. And he had a pad and paper by his bed in case he had an idea that in a dream or something, so he could write it down when he woke up. So he woke up in the middle of the night and he'd had this dream, and he wrote it down. And it had been his experience that most of the time when he did that, he looked at the results the next morning and thought they were terrible. But in this instance, he thought the cartoon was pretty good. It was a cartoon about a maid and the people who employ her. A couple had come home, and she was giving them a message, and she couldn't remember any detail of the message. So the caption was something like, Mr. Harmon or Marmon called around 7:30, or maybe it was 8:30, and said that he wants to meet you tomorrow in the afternoon, or maybe it's the morning, at 123 Rose Street, or maybe it's 123 something other. The whole thing was like that. And so she gets through giving this description of the message in which she conveys that she knows very little of it. And then at the end she says, oh, and by the way, he said it was very important. So that was the first cartoon he ever did about a maid, and he sold it to the Saturday Evening Post.
Was that after he left the service? Because he was
No, I think that I was trying to figure this out
drawing cartoons
recently.
while he was in the military, right?
Yeah, but I think it was before he was in the service. I was trying to figure this out, and I can't remember exactly. He went into the service either in 1943 or 1944. But by that time, by the time he was drawing cartoons in the military, at least the ones I've seen, Hazel had evolved from the original stupid maid in the first cartoon to become Hazel, the Hazel that is still in circulation today.
When did the television show
1961 through 1966 in prime time.
To what extent was he involved in the television show?
A large extent. He didn't write any of the scripts for it, but he was involved in negotiating the deal that got it on television, and he was involved in producing what's called a Bible, which is a description of how the character acts and what she's like and that type of thing. And he went out to Hollywood to meet the writers and meet Shirley Booth, and there are some, actually have some publicity photos of him with Shirley Booth dressed as Hazel.
That must have been something back then. That was still the early years, relatively early years of television.
Relatively, yes.
Was it black and white or color back then? I don't even remember.
It started out in black and white, but it went to color. And it went to color pretty early because it was initially on NBC, which was, of course, owned by RCA, which made color TV sets.
Sure, yeah. You know, as a business journalist, you were more than a little familiar with the importance of luck in any venture. Well, acknowledging your father's talent, to what extent was luck important in his success? Being at the right place at the right time, coming up with the right idea at the right time, meeting the right people at the right time. He had collaborators and partners along the way, didn't he?
Yes. Mostly, though, he worked by himself. He had collaborators in a couple of, in his later years, not real later years, but from about the 70s on, he worked with various people in trying to put together movies and that type of thing. But he would say, you know, fortune played a big role in his life, and it was just many odd coincidences occurred to him over the years. Initially, the way he came to New York was sort of odd because he originally went down to Los Angeles, and while he was there, this is after graduating from Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley in 1933, and he went down there to write, and while he was there, he wrote a screenplay about a character called Major Hoople, who was in a comic panel called Our Boarding House. And the Major Hoople character in the comic panel appeared to be based on W.C. Fields. It looked like him, etc. So my father thought, well, I can write a movie about Major Hoople that would make you know, a great W.C. Fields movie. So he writes the script, gets an agent. The agent submits it to the studio that has Fields' contract, and it looks like it's going to go great. And the agent's telling my father he's going to be a star. Don't worry, I'll get this done. So my father doesn't hear from him for about a week and calls up to see what's going on. They just, don't worry, everything's fine,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. The next week he calls, the agent's a little cooler. This goes on over time. And finally, the agent stops returning his calls. My father eventually goes to New York, becomes a cartoonist, and meets my mother. Years later, somebody told him the story of what had happened, someone who knew the agent. And it turned out that Fields' contract with the studio called for the studio to do a specified number of movies starring Fields. So the agent knew that, and he figured he had the studio over a barrel because he had a Fields movie. So he was trying to jack up the studio for as much money as he could get. Fields, however, had a drinking problem, and while the agent was trying to negotiate with the studio, Fields went on a bender. He had a morals clause in his contract, and the studio fired him. And so, if it hadn't been for the fact
Yes.
that Fields was an alcoholic, then my father would never have ended up going back to,
Yeah.
New York, and he never would have met my mother, and I wouldn't be here.
Which did your father enjoy most, writing or drawing? Because he seems to have played on both sides.
I don't know. I think he enjoyed them both equally.
Yeah.
He always wanted to be a cartoonist. I know that much. From the time he was a little kid drawing pictures in the dirt with sticks. But he also liked writing, too. He never used the gag man for any of his cartoons until I graduated from college, and then I wrote gags for Hazel for 8 years. So I think he liked them both equally. The drawing was mechanical, though. I mean, and he thought that, too. So if he was in his studio, and his studio was in his house, and was thinking of gags or writing something, he had the door closed and we couldn't come in. I had two brothers, 10 and 8 years older than me.
Yeah.
I still have them, actually. But once he had come up with gags and was drawing cartoons, he didn't care if he was interrupted or not because, like I said, drawing to him was mechanical. He could just sit there and draw at the drawing board and talk to people and that type of stuff. So when I was a little kid, I used to come home from school and sit in the couch in his studio and watch him draw.
Did he have a favorite time of the day when he felt he was most creative? The people I've interviewed in the past, authors, artists, other performers, seem to have a time of the day when they feel they're most creative. They're at their peak creativity.
Not that I ever knew
No?
of, no. He worked mostly during the day, but he would write stuff at night too. So I don't think that mattered to him. I mean, he was very disciplined in how he worked. He was very good at disciplining himself to work.
Was he a harsh critic? When you came up with a gag, how did he react if he didn't care for it? Go back and do it again?
No, well, it wasn't exactly like that. I mean, because I would write. He had to do 6 panels a week for King Features, so I would come up with 12 gags, and each gag would have multiple captions. And so he'd read it, and if it was really good, he'd say, "This is great," and we'd figure out what the best caption was. If he really didn't think it would work, then he'd say, "No, I don't think this would work." And if I felt differently, then I'd say, "Well, no, I think you're not considering this." Most of the time, it was kind of in between.
Well, how did it work? Did you write a gag and then he drew to it, or did he give you a drawing and say,
Oh, no. I came up
How
with
does it work?
A gag writer for a cartoon comes up with the entire concept of the cartoon. He doesn't
Oh.
just come up with the caption. He comes up with the whole idea for the cartoon. So I would come up with the whole concept for the cartoon and write it down and put like about 6 captions underneath each one. And I'd do this actually. My brother, David, was at Conestoga High School. For some reason, he had this habit. He might have done this in junior high school too. He liked stealing paper, so he'd accumulated this real massive paper. So from like 1975 through about 1983, I used up all the paper David had stolen. So
speaking of paper, I'm looking at a cartoon that your father drew for you on the occasion of your birthday and graduation from undergraduate or graduate?
graduate school.
Graduate school. You got your MBA and then went into journalism. Let me just read this to you. They gave your mother and father, gave you a gift of a Subaru.
Yes.
Right? And when was that? October
16th, 1985.
1985. The Subaru is given to you with love and joy, which is what you have brought to our lives. What a wonderful human being you are. How lucky we are to have you as a son. We are blessed. Thank you for fulfilling our lives and being who you are. We love you. We always will. Ted and Ann.
He's probably drunk when he wrote that.
I doubt it. Anyway, it's a great cartoon of Hazel in your Subaru.
Yes.
Yeah? Uh-huh. And did you resurrect this from all the treasures you're now finding, or have you had it since then?
Oh, no, I've had it since then. I guess you could say I resurrected it, but it's just a matter of having a ton of stuff of mine that was from him, and then a ton of stuff of his pretty much all around my house, and in figuring out what I was going to give the various people or try to send out for publicity around his efforts in Peabody and Sherman. I just came up, I searched through everything I had.
Yeah.
I still haven't found everything I was looking for either.
Well, you found this, and
That's an all-time
what is
classic.
this, please?
This is from an article in the Evening and Sunday Bulletin, as it was known at the time.
Yes.
Philadelphia Bulletin in 1961. Back in those days, enchiladas were a tremendous rarity in this area. And my mom had a great recipe from them, having been raised in California, as was my father, though they were raised in different parts of the state. So this article in the Bulletin was ostensibly about my father, but also about my mother's enchilada recipe, and it included the recipe for enchiladas. And this was taken at the dining room table in the dining room, obviously, of their home in Valley Forge, Tredyffrin Township. And there were a number of publicity photos he did like this, where he would be photographed with someone, in this case with my mom, and then he'd draw in Hazel later.
So Hazel was dropped in this photo,
Yes.
and published as we see it in the bulletin?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And that's your mom and dad?
Yes, in
That's-
1961.
That's quite a jacket.
Yeah, pretty awesome, isn't it?
Right. Who does he look like in that jacket? Who was the television personality who had a talk show? Oh, shoot. He discovered Carol Burnett.
Gary Moore?
Gary Moore. He looks like Gary Moore.
He does.
Yeah.
In fact, people used to say that he looked like Gary Moore, and he knew Gary Moore. He was on I've Got a Secret.
And tell us what these. Let's go to Peabody and Sherman. Now, he created the original characters that evolved over time into Peabody and Sherman. Is that correct?
Over a very short period of time, what happened was this. This is Johnny Daydream is the name of this. This is a photocopy of the storyboard for storyboard of a prototype of a cartoon that Ward was to use in The Adventures of Rocky and his friends.
Who was
Jay
Ward?
Ward.
Yeah. And who was he?
He was a childhood friend of my uncle's. What happened was my father's parents moved from Fresno, where my father grew up, to Berkeley, so that my father and his older brother Hank could live at home while they attended the University of California at Berkeley. And there, Lenny befriended Jay Ward and Alex Anderson. And Alex Anderson was the nephew of the Terrytoons founder. I believe his name was Paul Terry. So years later, they went into animation together and created the first cartoon ever made for television called Crusader Rabbit. And during that time, then Alex Anderson thought up this idea of another cartoon show called the Frostbite Falls Review, and it had Rocky and Bullwinkle in it. And he ended up going into advertising and leaving the Rocky and Bullwinkle characters to Jay Ward. And when Jay was trying to get the Rocky and Bullwinkle characters on TV, my uncle got a deal with a sponsor, General Mills, but they wanted a half-hour show.
Right.
So they needed more characters than just Rocky and Bullwinkle. So my uncle, Lenny, turned to my father, and he came up with this idea of Johnny Daydream and his pet, Beware the Dog. And they traveled through time using devices on Johnny's belt and Beware's collar.
So this was an early rendering?
No, this is many years later. This was done in the late 1990s or in early 2000. He just did some sketches of Peabody and Sherman because he wanted to do a drawing. I don't know why he did the original one, but he eventually made copies of it and gave the drawing to his family of Hazel and Peabody and Sherman.
And then we have these, which are from a book.
Well, those actually they're originally not from a book. They're in a book now.
Okay.
But those were not done by my father. They were done by a man named Al Sheen, and who worked for Jay Ward. And they are the original model sheets. That's the original model sheet for Sherman.
Yeah.
And it was filed with the copyright registration for the Sherman character. This is the original model sheet for Mr. Peabody, and it was filed with the copyright registration for the Peabody character. And if you look, see the copyright registration is Key Ward, who was Jay Ward, and Scott, who was Bill Scott, who was the co-producer with Ward of Rocky and His Friends, the co-writer of the show, and the voice of many of the characters, including Peabody and Bullwinkle.
And then we have this.
And that's the drawing that my father made for friends in his family in the late 90s or early 2000s. It's the only time he ever drew Peabody, Sherman, and Hazel together.
His most prominent, most important.
Yes, the three most important characters.
You mentioned a film that he hoped to make. Were there other projects that did not quite live up to his expectations, and how did he handle that?
Oh, he handled them fine, but I mean there were also there are also 4 films that got made based on story ideas of his. Walt Disney, the Disney Company, made 3 movies of his in the 1970s: The $1 Million Duck, Gus, and The Cat from Outer Space, which he wrote the script for. And Walter Shenson, who produced A Hard Day's Night, made Digby, the Biggest Dog in the World, based on The Biggest Dog in the World, a children's book my father wrote and illustrated. But when he couldn't sell something, he'd either, if he believed in it enough, he'd keep going with it. But he'd also just go on to the next thing too. I mean, initially when he was starting out as a cartoonist, he'd be one of many cartoonists making the rounds of multiple magazines in New York. And so he was used to getting cartoons rejected, used to getting ideas rejected. And if he let rejections get to him, he wouldn't have been in the business too long.
I think I read someplace that he was employed by Disney for a very short time.
Yes, that was back around the time he ended up writing the script for W.C. Fields. He worked for Walt Disney for a week as an animator. I don't know if he ever met Disney or not, but for Disney Studios. And he got fired. And again, years later, he found out what happened. At the time, he thought it was because he wasn't a good enough artist. But he ran into someone else who had worked there, and the person asked him who fired him. And my father described the guy. And the person my father ran into said, well, he was always firing people. He just liked firing people. And eventually, Walt Disney found out what he was doing and fired him.
Did your dad know Walt Disney? Did they have a relationship?
No, not
Business
that I
relationship? know of. Did your dad have good business instincts? Once again, you have a business background. Did he have good business instincts? Was he able to do a deal, negotiate a deal, or did you leave that to other people to do it on his behalf?
He did have good business instincts, but I think, and he also had people who negotiated for him, obviously. But the deal that got Hazel on the air, he put together himself with my uncle. And what happened was that Curtis Publishing Company, which still puts out the Saturday Evening Post, but then it was owned by different people, it didn't want for many years Hazel to become a TV show because it was afraid that the sponsor, the companies that advertised in its magazine would be angry that there were different companies perhaps sponsoring the show. But it finally reached the point where it needed money badly enough that it decided to let Hazel get made into a show, and it negotiated a deal. My father saw the deal. He thought it was awful. And he had talked to people over the years about what would make about the Hazel show. So he asked if he could put together a deal for it. And they said, sure. So he went to New York, and he and my uncle went out to lunch, and they came up with the components of what they wanted to ask for. And so my father went into the Screen Gems office in New York, and said, you know, what we'd like this. And they said, fine. We'd like this. He said, fine. This goes on. Every condition he names, they agree to. So he struck this deal that he's very pleased with. He's very happy. They're sitting there talking. And the person who ran Screen Gems in New York then, John Mitchell, said to him, well, you know, you're happy with this deal, yes? And my father said, yes, of course. And he said, well, we're all friends, right? And he said, yes. And he said, well, I'll tell you how come we agreed to everything. It's because when you were out at lunch, we were at the table behind you. We heard everything you said, and we knew what you were going to come in here and ask for. So, you know, it was a great example of my father thinking for a while he was this shrewd businessman, and all of a sudden, there goes that balloon.
How did the film Mr. Peabody and Sherman come about?
I don't know exactly because I'm not in contact with with Jay Ward's daughter, Tiffany Ward, who was involved in putting it out. DreamWorks Animation was also involved in putting it out, and I know that they bought a company that was acting on behalf of Tiffany Ward and acting on behalf of the owners of a lot of characters like Casper the Friendly Ghost and that type of thing. But her father, Jay Ward, passed away in the late 1980s, and then she had been trying to revive the characters, the various characters he was involved with since then, and others had been made into movies. There was a Boris and Natasha movie, a movie featuring Rocky and Bullwinkle, a movie featuring Dudley Do-Right, and a movie featuring George of the Jungle. This is the latest, and I think this is the only one that's fully computer animated.
Those titles are bringing back a lot of memories.
Yeah, they should.
My kids and myself early. Did you ever aspire to become a cartoonist?
Not really, no. Although I did when I was in junior high and high school, I drew some cartoon strips, just kind of joking around, but they were more based on things like Zap comics, which were popular at the time.
Do you doodle now?
Not at all.
No?
No.
That's surprising. I would have thought that some of it would have rubbed off. And of course, when you were writing gags and so on, when you were in undergraduate school and graduate school.
Well, it rubbed, though. I mean, one time when I worked for the Indianapolis Star from 1992 through 1998, and one time I was at this incredibly boring meeting, and I came up with the idea of having a chain of restaurants in Philadelphia. It was based on the idea that no one in Indianapolis knew how to make a hoagie. You couldn't get a good hoagie out there. And of course, places all over the country try to tout that they have real Philly cheesesteaks. So I thought it'd be an interesting idea would be to come back to Philadelphia and open a chain of hoagie stands that made really bad hoagies like they were made in Indianapolis and call them Hoosier Hoagies. And I came up with this idea of a character named Mr. Hoosier who would be the mascot for the chain. He's sort of like Mr. Peanut, just instead of having a body shaped like a peanut, he had a body shaped like the state of Indiana.
Peter, I think you'd have a hard time getting funding for that.
I did get a friend of mine to draw it, however.
Oh, you did?
Yes,
Okay, well,
to draw Mr. Hoosier.
Good first step. I understand that there is a musical in the works as well around
Yes.
Hazel?
Yes, that started actually before my father passed away. A composer and lyricist, the composer is Ron Abel and the lyricist is Chuck Steffen, approached him in sometime in the middle of last decade about making a musical and weren't able to come to terms, I think because my father didn't completely understand the terms they were asking for. And so we did that fairly recently, and they're working on it with a TV writer named Lissa Levin.
That's great. We'll watch for it then. But in the meantime, we'll all enjoy Mr. Peabody and Sherman at your local theater. Thank you very much for being here. It's been
Thanks
a
for
pleasure.
having me.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time, this is 30 Minutes. I am Rick Anthony. Take very good care of yourselves